Fountain Street Church, happy Sunday. Epiphany. Epiphany is the holiday of Epiphany. It falls, I think, Tuesday this week. It's a midwinter festival. It was assembled, just like all the rest, from the wreckage of various antecedents to Christianity, all the non-Christian traditions and pagan religions and other things, into this day, and then it was baptized into the church. We get the holidays. And it was never really figured out what Epiphany was supposed to be about. This is the only pulpit where they're going to say that this morning. Depending on which church you're sitting in, some of them are going to do it next week. Some will do it this week. It's either going to be about the journey of the Magi following a star, or it's going to celebrate Jesus' baptism by John in the Jordan, or it may celebrate the wedding in Cana, his business with the water into the wine. We all know that story. The thread that connects these three stories, though, regardless of which story is being told, is the theology of hospitality. In the early Christian communities, an understanding of the new cosmology, this new identity, was that it could not be held captive to any one culture or ethnicity or even any one religion. All right? That's a novel thing, and it was dangerous at the time in the first century to have an understanding of the universe that says it's for the whole world, it's for all people. It was only later Christians that somehow succeeded in drawing lines and circles and boundaries. It was later Christians that succeeded, I think, in limiting hope or limiting salvation. The earliest church was a Universalist movement. It adopted a theology of radical hospitality. And it is radical. It was radical then because it landed them in Roman prisons and got a lot of them martyred. And it is still radical today. It's radical in the course of human history to claim that it's a good and holy thing to show hospitality to strangers. And Fountain Street Church, I think that this place embodies that theology in its anti-creedalism, in its historic refusal to draw lines to keep people out. Now, in practice, this church hasn't always gotten it right. I know that there are folks in Grand Rapids who believe that Fountain Street has fallen short of these values, and it's also worthwhile to listen to them, because this is part of the story as well. History and mythology tend to remember and celebrate the ones who say yes, but we also remember the ones who say no. And we don't always know why they say no. I mean, maybe there really wasn't any room at the inn in Bethlehem. It's just, maybe Mary and Joseph, there just was no space. But we don't tell the story of the innkeeper of Bethlehem with a kind of patient and loving pragmatism, you know. Well, that's very reasonable. In 1929, the Great Depression hit Grand Rapids, and it hit Fountain Street Church just as hard as it hit everywhere else. In October of 1929, the whole world seemed to come unglued following the crash of the stock market. And by the following January in 1930, this church was taking action. But I want to set the stage. During the decade leading up to 1930, Fountain Street Church had made and kept a promise to the city of Grand Rapids. And by 1929, this place was still shiny and new. In 1917, their former church had burned to the ground. And in 1917, their minister at the time, a man named Alfred Wesley Wishart, had been serving Fountain Street for just over a decade. He was established, and the church burned, and there's no record of him panicking or freaking out, which is amazing. He rose to the occasion. He really did. And following the fire of 1917, they relocated to the Powers Theater. And the Powers Theater was one of the antecedents to our beautiful Civic Theater today. It was in a different location. But you could imagine us worshiping in the Civic Theater, I think. And they did that for almost 7 years, 1917 to 1924. The Fountain Streeters worshiped and gathered in that theater in the wilderness, while down the street this place was being built. In 1924, then, they moved home. They moved here to this place, and then they dedicated together this new auditorium, which is the word that they used for the sanctuary, auditorium. At the time it was built, this was the largest hall in the city of Grand Rapids, and the bell tower was the tallest building in the city. And all of it together was promised by the church to be a space for the benefit of the whole city. That's why we have theater seats instead of pews. And that's why the entries to the church are directly at street level. Don't find that in all of our sibling churches. And that's why I've been told that that's why there's 2 aisles instead of 1 center aisle. Everything was intended to show hospitality to the entire city. So it made perfect sense to utilize the tower as the World War I memorial for the city, because the tower itself and the building attached to it was viewed by the congregation as a gift to be shared with the city. And this auditorium was immediately put to good use. In 1924, they continued, and they had a practice of this, but they continued to host major gatherings and performances and great speeches and slideshows. Boy, let me tell you, folks, in the 1920s, a slideshow, that was a big deal, all right? You see the teenagers out there. Oh boy, did you catch that slideshow on Friday? Let me tell you, it was the cat's meow. Oh. Get a wiggle on you, dewdroppers. Head on down to the Baptist church for that slideshow. Okay, for 6 years, this church thrived in that role, having events here. And Reverend Wishart stepped into his role as a municipal leader and troublemaker. That guy could pick a fight with the city commission. It was a glorious thing to see. That's another sermon. But from 1924 to 1929, this place really roared to life. And then late in 1929, the country came apart at the seams. By 1929, you had about maybe 1,400 on the rolls, participating actively as members of the church. In 1929, though, when things started to come unglued, finance capital had really kind of taken over the world, really. Everything now was owned. Banks, bank accounts, pensions, houses, everything else had become investment devices. And so they were familiar with market crashes. It's still capitalism. You do it, and then every 25 years, everything breaks, and you got to do it again. You have to have socialism for a minute, and then you get to have capitalism again. Seems to be the way we do things in America. But in 29, the crash was different, because this was the first time that finance capital had been in the driver's seat. And pretty much immediately, over the next couple years, in fact, 2 million Americans became homeless. That would be comparable to 6 million Americans today. If 6 million people in this country became homeless in a very, very short period of time. So you had great waves of people migrating across the country, economic refugees, and the cities were filled with the desperate poor, which was an immediate crisis. 1930 then was a year of panic and terror and scarcity. And it was a year of people desperately trying to squeeze a little bit of blood from stones. Everything from the cost of food to the price of a theater ticket skyrocketed. And in the face of all of that, Fountain Street Church made a decision. It made a choice. And it'd be easy to claim that Reverend Wishart made this choice on behalf of the church, but that ain't how it works around here. Never has been. The reality is that he didn't have that kind of power. He was established and he was beloved by the church and by the progressive leaders of the city, and he'd earned a great deal of trust, but it wasn't his choice to make because this place had been built by the members. By blood, sweat, and tears, they built it. Beginning in 1930, they made the choice, the real choice, to give it away, to stop charging rent. Now, they began with students. So the very first move, the very first inkling of this concept begins with local students from the Grand Rapids Junior College, but also students who could make the journey up from Kalamazoo College, because at that time, Kalamazoo College was an institution that had foundational ties to this church. The church made all the seats in the balcony free to any student for any show or performance or anything that was happening here. And then they pretty much quickly after that included high school students who could come to events for free. Any event at Fountain Street was free to students. And then they made it to just about any person coming to an event. They only accepted money to cover the costs of the events themselves, but by 1932, the events were free. The overwhelming majority of the events were free. Now, to say that this frustrated some in the business community might be a little bit of an understatement. Theaters wanted to sell tickets to stuff. Everyone was too broke to buy tickets. Here comes this Fountain Street place just giving the damn thing away. A few frustrated capitalists wrote letters to the newspapers, the Herald and the Press, demanding that they stop advertising these Fountain Street church events in the newspaper. It's bad for business, see? And I'd have thought that the Herald would have gone along with it, because that was kind of a conservative rag at the time. But in the editorial section of the Herald in 1931, there's a note that responds to the complaints from the business owners, says, quote, "These events at Fountain Street Church are brought here on a basis easily within mass reach, and the whole city's permitted to hear top-notch lecturers of the present day. It's a rare civic privilege. When such a treat is brought to us, the editorial column has no compunctions against free advertising. Dr. Wishart's church deserves credit and support in so ambitious, so forward-thinking, and so useful a civic contribution." Wishart even would write letters apologizing in the newspaper if they did charge admission. They would sometimes have a VIP section in the front, and they would sell VIP tickets to cover the cost of the events. And he wrote in the newspaper, "Times are hard and money's scarce. If all legitimate expenses are included, the church has paid out money every year to maintain these programs. This is for the benefit of the city. Ours is strictly non-sectarian, non-commercial, and non-profitable. Our sole aim ever is the public good." You can see why they started calling him a socialist. They did. And so Wishart responded by preaching a series of sermons about the values and importance of Christian socialism. And then they grumbled and started calling him a communist. Now, I don't have enough time to get into the Red Scare that they leveled at Reverend Wishart in the early 30s. But I want to read one quote of his about communism that Reverend Wishart wrote in the Herald. Quote, "The appeal to the fears of businessmen by suggesting communistic uprising are so specious, shallow, and tricky, I wonder they can swallow it at all. No, in fact, it's dishonest business, like the mismanagement of the affairs of the government, that breeds communism. What really brought on communism in Russia was autocracy and political corruption." Wishart used to run a newspaper in Trenton, New Jersey, before he became a minister, so he knew what he was doing. But then Fountain Street went, I guess, too far, a bridge too far. By 1932, they were busting at the seams. They discovered the magic that makes things go, all while the other churches were shutting down. But they were thriving. They were thriving. Other churches were closing their doors or selling their buildings, mainly to fraternal organizations. A lot of Shriners, Odd Fellows. But Fountain Street was growing. And Fountain Street began offering its social hall for dinner clubs, for dinner space. They had a lot of lunches and dinner clubs. Lunch for a penny, supper for a nickel, free for those in need. And this really pissed a lot of people off. 1932, so this is the last story I'll tell about this. But in 1932 in Grand Rapids, there was a petition that was collected by some anonymous group and delivered to the city commission. And on its face, it was an ordinary petition. It just was, quote, it said, "The undersigned respectfully petition your honorable body to take necessary steps to regulate or abolish any so-called eating establishments that are operating contrary to the city ordinance." And the citizens who signed this petition were told it was to shut down the speakeasies and the disreputable eateries or whatever. It's public safety. Now it's a ticket. Right before they handed the petition to the city commission, they changed it. They changed the petition to read, quote, "The undersigned are informed that Fountain Street Baptist Church served meals to the public through banquets, luncheons, etc., thus competing with regularly established businesses," end quote. The people who had been rooked into signing the petition were furious. And the owners of the Pantland Hotel and the Morton Hotel and the Walgreen Company wrote sincere apologies and demanded an explanation for this tomfoolery. Quote, "I signed no petition naming that church, and I would not," said Mr. Duffy, manager of the Pantland Hotel. It must have been inserted afterward, which it was. This is what radical hospitality will get you. It will get you attention. Attention from the people, but attention from the powers and principalities. Because the powers and principalities, they don't pay attention to you unless you're costing them something. That petition, the schemes to try to shut these programs down, the attacks on your church, they didn't happen just because you were hosting a few public events out of the goodness of your hearts. You were threatening the systems of extraction in an age of imposed scarcity and hardship. You were using the things that you'd built, the resources you'd gathered together, to put a candle in the window and give poor people hope. And now we know that free lunches and free concerts didn't run anyone out of business. Quite the contrary. They brought people downtown. They maintained the civic culture down here in this city, and they grew the city into a place where people wanted to be. And I'll say that St. Cecilia's Music Society came right along for the ride. God bless them. Park Church even dabbled its toe in for one summer. Once. This stuff continued, and they added each year, they added free educational courses and then college seminars and other activities. In 1932, by 33, this place was a madhouse. But then what happened? What happened? Because by 1940, the church is damn near empty. What happened? Well, tragedy. In 1933, the minister, Alfred Wishart, suffered a massive heart attack, and he died in his bed. And the church mourned his death, and the city mourned the death of this funny, radical minister who wrote all the blistering editorials in the newspaper. And then in 1934, the church called his replacement, the Reverend Milton McGorrell. And I've spent enough time trying to empathize with McGorrell that I don't blame him anymore for the decisions that he made or for what came next. Because he showed up here in 34 and he took a look around and he saw all this stuff happening, all the concerts and lectures and dinners and classes and everything, and he said, I think probably as any reasonable person might say, well, why the hell aren't we selling tickets to this stuff? The Depression-era magic that Wishart had got going, it hadn't lasted long enough to put down roots, to turn into policies, see? And there wasn't institutional memory enough. So they started charging for admission. Not market rate. They weren't gouging people. It was just to, offset the cost of the operations. It was reasonable. First the concerts and lectures, and then everything else. And in McGorrell's defense, when you open the books, the financial ledger of the church, and you do see in 35 this brief spike in revenue, and it lasted about a year. About a year. And then you see the crash. It took 6 years for the church to fall from its pinnacle in 33 to 39, when it became a panic for the church leaders. And by 41, it's a catastrophe. Fewer than 100 people in worship and still falling. And the place is empty. And they can't fill the 10 rows of seats for the concerts. A lot of darkness. Things get bleak. There are serious conversations about selling the building. McGorrell, for his part, he hangs on all the way through the beginning of 42 before finally being shown the door. They were going to rent out parts of the building. And then in 43, they call a new minister. They find this funny guy from the University of Chicago. He's got a lot of energy, Scottish name, Duncan Littlefair. You might have heard of him. He inherits a wreckage, and he's got good ideas. And things start to change again. The Great Depression was a time of darkness in America, and it was a time when churches were closing, especially liberal churches in this country, especially liberal churches in the 30s. Churches closing with astonishing rapidness, mainly liberal ones, and one church in one city made a wild bet, decided to do things in an upside-down way, and it shouldn't have worked. It was counterintuitive and risky, and according to the smartest businessmen, it was a terrible investment. But I think the church leaders probably looked at the businessmen and their investment plans and were like, well, how's that working for you? Radical hospitality is hard work. It costs money, it takes sweat and tears, and you got to deal with a lot of voices demanding that you stop giving away the shop and just do the sensible thing and sell tickets, damn it. Just charge rent. But the generosity that flowed, the financial generosity, the philanthropy that came as a response to this church's sacrificial love, it kept this place solvent, whole, and growing. And does it work today? Yes, it does. It works today. My whole professional career has been based on this. I've seen it in 8 churches in 5 cities. It works. It takes a lot of work. It takes many hands. But you will put a candle in the window in dark times, Fountain Street. You always have. You always have. And from that candle, you will become a house of light and hope for this city. You've done it before. You've done it at least 4 times before, by my reckoning, and you'll keep doing it. This place is bigger on the inside than it is on the outside. You know that, right? Hold fast to your practice of radical hospitality. It can save lives. It can even be a fetter to the worst of the empire. And it can become a light on a lampstand or a star hanging in the sky. Many wanderers are coming. Many. Be the star that shows them the way home. Amen.